Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last in our May webinar series. We are so glad you're here. We're hoping everybody's holding up okay. Today's topic is a good one. It is understanding bias, a nuanced approach to a vital news literacy topic. My name is Miriam Romace, and I am NLP's Professional Engagement Manager. And I will thank you again multiple times because we appreciate this so much that we're actually going to make sure everybody has the recording afterwards. I hope you guys follow us on Instagram, Twitter. We had that first slide with all our where you can find us. We are new to Instagram, so if you're on there, please be sure to give us a shout out about anything you might find very useful. This is a really important topic, as you all know, because you're here. Okay, so as we move on, we already mentioned this is the last in our webinar series. It will be recorded. You'll have access to all the recordings. And if you are new to this Zoom platform, which probably you are well versed in it now, make sure that to chat amongst yourselves, you use the chat room for all participants. And if you have questions for the panelists, make sure you put it in the Q&A box. We will be paying attention to that pretty thoroughly. Just reminding everybody, you are muted. And your questions, we have several stop points throughout to answer a few questions. We'll also have a special Q&A time at the very end. And we're going to download all the questions and answer any others that we have not gotten to. This will all be made available to you in a resource folder that we'll share later. And we're able to do this thanks to our awesome education team. So Peter Adams will be presenting. We're also going to have Susanna Gonzalez helping out with the Q&A here and there. So Susanna has worked in journalism for 20 years and most recently as a correspondent for Reuters in Chicago. We have John Silva, we have Jordan on deck, and me. So we'll all be helping answer any questions you all have. So hello, everybody, and Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Miriam. I appreciate all the setup and introduction, and thank you all for joining us here for the fourth and final session in our webinar series. Very high interest topic, and the goal today really is to explore the topic of bias in news coverage, about which a lot of people have a lot of strong feelings. Obviously, students are intensely interested in this. And it's a very complex topic. So we are going to try to explore some of the thornier questions, but also provide you with an approach that we think offers you a clear but nuanced pathway to helping students understand how to evaluate bias in coverage that they see, and then when maybe a response from them is warranted. We know from lots of public opinion surveys, here's one from January 2018, that Americans think they're seeing more bias in news. You see a lot of people lament, engaging in kind of golden ageism, saying that they yearn for the days of Walter Cronkite, as though news media then were somehow much less biased than they are now. I'm not sure that's true, but there are more accusations of bias now. And it has become a real strategy, both politically and among pundits and between news outlets. So in January 2018, Gallup found that 45% of Americans see a great deal of bias in the news media. And then again in June of 2018, that 62% of Americans say that the news that they see in newspapers, on TV, and via radio, they believe is biased. So those are some pretty substantial numbers, but we also know that people say around the world, the US is no exception, that they want unbiased news. Today I think we're going to delve into some important driving questions. Number one, what do people mean when they talk about news media bias? So what counts as news media bias, and who decides? There's rarely any consensus around that. It's highly debated. And what can journalists and news organizations do to minimize bias? So also, what does, quote unquote, unbiased news look like that people think they want? The way we define news media bias here at NLP is when assumptions or opinions favoring one side or one particular interpretation or perspective on an issue or an event skew news reporting in a way that is either unfair or distorting. So it doesn't represent the reality, is how we define that. And some supporting questions I think that we will get to today and that are helpful to keep in mind are, people are very fond of saying that a particular news outlet is left-leaning or leans left or skews right or is right of center. But I always think that the question, what counts as the center, what is this center, and who decides is an important question to keep in mind. And also our own perceptions and biases. We are biased readers and consumers of news, more so about some issues than others. Our consumption of news is partial and imperfect, so we might hear one report but not see a follow-up. We might see the follow-up but not the original report. So we don't always have a complete picture, but I think people are prone often to making snap judgments about coverage they see. And then, is bias always partisan? A lot of people only talk about news media bias in partisan terms, but what else counts as bias and who decides? And then finally, is this notion of journalistic objectivity or objectivity in journalism helpful? And how can we help students sort of think about that? So those are some of the things that we're going to try to dive into here. But first, we'd like to ask you a poll question. We're going to give you a series of statements and ask which most accurately reflects your perception of bias in the news media. So I'm going to launch this. This is actually a question we ask students in our lesson on the Checkology virtual classroom, which we launched last year. So go ahead and take a moment to vote. I know the statements are a little long, so it's going to take a moment. But basically, most journalists and news outlets don't really consider this issue. Most journalists and news outlets intentionally bias their work and try to get their audience to believe specific things. Most try to make their straight news reporting as impartial or unbiased as possible, but they have blind spots that cause them to fall short, or I haven't really thought about this. And we'll see how your answers sort of break down and then take a look at how students answer this question on Checkology. So the majority of you, 80+%, I'm just going to end it here, say that most journalists and news outlets actually try to make their straight news reporting as impartial or unbiased as possible, but they have blind spots and often or sometimes fall short, that sometimes cause them to fall short. Here I can share these results as well so you can see them. And this is how students on Checkology answered this question. So you can see more students at the top there thinking that journalists and news organizations don't really consider this or think about this, or that they are intentionally sort of strategically biased. That's a very popular, almost 30% of students answer that way at the beginning of our lesson. And two other questions that I'd love for you to think about. I think there are some parallels there are lots of parallels actually between educators and journalists. And one point that I think is important to make here when thinking about bias is that while everyone has biases, we are not always at the mercy of our biases. So it is possible to do your work in a way that leaves your personal biases out. And so a question I would pose to you just for reflection, we don't really need people to answer this in the chat, is whether it's possible for you to leave your personal politics out of your teaching. Maybe you're a civics teacher or a history teacher, or you cover current events or discuss current events with your students. Is it possible for you to do that work in a way that is fair and accurate, that leaves any sort of personal biases out of that? And likewise, do you strive to keep your personal biases about specific students from negatively affecting how you treat them? So, treating all students fairly. I think that's something that the vast majority of educators do, and that can kind of help you draw that issue into focus. The fact that having a bias doesn't mean that it is that you're at the mercy of it, or that it is always at play. Certainly all human beings have experiences and biases, and that's an important thing to realize. But I thought those two questions could kind of home in on that or focus that question for everybody. Before we dive into the framework, though, I do want to look at a few recent examples. As you know, yesterday, a well-known AIDS activist passed away at the age of 84, a playwright, Larry Kramer. And the New York Times had this headline and abstract at the top of the story. But this particular abstract is not the first that was published. And some of you may have seen this play out online. The very first version of that abstract actually said the second sentence, it was broken into two sentences and said, but his often abusive approach could overshadow his achievements. So he did take some very bold, what the Times would later call aggressive protest actions. So this particular wording got a lot of pushback on Twitter. And I think it's very important to track these kinds of debates as you sort of seek to develop a more nuanced understanding, but also a nuanced understanding of the concept itself, but also of the contemporary conversations about news media bias and usage. So here's someone responding, saying that they called him abusive in his obituary. That's really offensive. This is why we can't let mainstream publications have the last word on our lives. So sort of impugning the entire source of the New York Times. Another one pointing out that this is the same publication that called Mike Brown, quote, no angel, and made that comparison. And then another person sort of in shock that they would use that term. So the New York Times then edited the headline, and I'm going to use the activity of a Twitter account called NYT Dip, which is a bot that actually just makes notes of edits to New York Times headlines and abstracts. And you can see their first edit was to change often abusive to just aggressive. They also changed the headline to playwright. Then they added the word sometimes, that it could sometimes overshadow. Then they changed aggressive to confrontational. And then they made a pretty substantial edit to the abstract to get it to its current version. So this is a great Twitter account to follow. It's also a great account to go back and look at specific edits. It's hard to often know, why. Not all edits are the result of errors. Not all edits are the result of bias. But it can be interesting to explore that as well. This happened to the Washington Post back in October. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Islamic State's head, died after he was being pursued by the US military near the Syrian-Turkish border. The original headline in the Washington Post was this, that they called him Islamic State's terrorist in chief. They then changed that to call him an austere religious scholar. This got widely scorned online. That prompted a huge backlash, and they finally settled on extremist leader of the Islamic State. Interestingly enough, if you go to this article now, the original URL is still at the top. So at a lot of news outlets and on a lot of websites, when you build a page, you need a URL. And if you make the URL the headline, that endures. So you can see that original headline is still in the URL. I think that's an interesting side note there, and it can be helpful sometimes to see if a headline has been changed. Not everyone adheres to that practice, but it can be helpful. You can also, of course, check archivers like the Internet Wayback Machine. You can see for this particular URL, it was archived 8 times on the 27th of October, and it's been saved 76 times between Baghdadi's death and April 27, when people stopped archiving it. So now a quick challenge for you all. This is easy to talk about. It's easy to speculate or to read bias into things you see. It's a little bit harder to craft a response yourselves. So I thought those of you who are brave enough in the chat might take a look at this finding from the Pew Research Center. Now, this isn't a piece of journalism, it's a public opinion poll, and a public data poll is, in this case, health data that they've pulled from Johns Hopkins. Give your shot at putting a headline on these findings. how would you characterize what this data shows? I'll give you just a minute. And again, if just a couple of you are brave enough to try to do this. To see if you can write a headline for this piece or summarize these findings. And then we'll take a look at what Pew did. And it caused a bit of a stir online when they did so. So John O'Hagan says, coronavirus deaths seemingly hit blue congressional districts hardest. COVID deaths higher in Democratic districts. Data indicates Democrat lead districts suffer more deaths. Blue areas hit harder. COVID hits majority Democratic districts hardest. Great, yeah. Okay, and some jokes in the chat as well. So you all get the idea. Let's take a look at what Pew did here. And this, again, prompted a lot of criticism online. So Pew focused on and framed this data as showing the steepest decline among Democratic led congressional districts on a 7-day rolling average. And the responses looked like this, right? So Pew is they aspire to be nonpartisan, and they got widely sort of criticized for this. They do excellent work. This isn't at all representative of the way they typically approach things, but it seems like, they maybe gave that particular poll result a bad frame. People then read sort of agendas and partisan intentions into that. And that's where we get into wary territory. We really don't know how the error happened. Pew might consider, explaining it, how it happened, but human error does happen. This is sort of how it was represented by some critics. And it really was used to take a shot at the mainstream media writ large. And that's one big red flag that I want to make sure that we draw into focus here together is, overgeneral or overbroad attacks against the media based on, in this case, something that wasn't even produced by a mainstream news outlet or a member of what most people think of as the mainstream media. And you can see that play out here as well. People attacked journalism. You can see in the bottom right, journalism 2020, no wonder so much divides this country. So people use this to attack the media, to attack journalism generally. So we are going to quickly just summarize a few key points to just sort of set up the first Q&A and just summarize some of what I tried to show in those first 3 examples. Number one, it's important to make sure, when you're approaching this topic yourself or with students, that you help them understand that conversations about news media bias mostly apply to straight news. Some people speculate that opinion departments at various news organizations overrepresent one perspective, that they lean a certain way. But by and large, opinion departments at news organizations are supposed to be expressing a point of view. Columns, editorials, pundits are supposed to be opinionated. So alleging bias, really doesn't make a lot of sense there. And most information we encounter every day doesn't aspire to be unbiased. Movie reviews certainly don't aspire to be unbiased. Social media posts that we all make as ordinary folks expressing our opinions don't aspire to be unbiased. So that's one sort of important distinction to help students sort of narrow down the body of pieces that they're looking at. And you can see this play out again. Here's an opinion piece by Kara Swisher, who's a technology reporter, prominent technology reporter, now a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. But this was perceived, at least by some, in this case, Donald Trump Jr., pretty prominent, as the New York Times is calling for Twitter to do this. In fact, this is just Swisher's opinion. So it's important to really be specific about, who made what claim, and to double check that if you're really talking about bias, you should make sure there was an aspiration to be unbiased. Second key point, our perceptions of news are highly subjective and imperfect. So we are all quite biased, and we bring our biases to news. And we're going to scrutinize coverage about issues that we care deeply about, much more than we are other kinds of coverage. And people typically think that the media is biased against their viewpoint, right? So nobody really walks around saying the media is so biased in favor of my views. They think the media is biased against them. In fact, you know, liberals, conservatives, progressives, and conservatives can see the same coverage, the same headline, the same piece, and see contradictory or opposing biases in that piece. So, you know, we are imperfect judges and evaluators of these kinds of things, and we need a method to do that. And we all, of course, perceive and interpret news based on our life experiences and our beliefs and values as well. So that's an important thing to remember. People often think that their perception of bias is you know, flawless, is a confirmation that bias exists, and it's good to interrogate our own perceptions before we respond publicly, before we take action. And this is just kind of our way of demonstrating in the lesson how these life experiences and worldviews, you know, can get shaped. We view everything through a specific lens, and that includes journalists. So that's part of why, you know, journalism has a methodology, which we'll talk about in a little bit. A great podcast to sort of get at this, and a great parallel, is to think about anyone who's in the position of adjudicating fairness, like refs at in sports. I think if you listen to a local broadcast of a local sports team, you'll hear very different kind of commentary than if you listen to a local broadcast from the opposing team. And again, people don't believe the refs are biased in their favor, but everybody thinks the refs are biased. So it's a little bit like the media. Sometimes that's a great starting place, or a good parallel, or a helpful parallel to use with students. Third key point, news media bias is usually incidental and debatable rather than intentional and overt. So I find that, you know, many people and most teens think that bias is nefarious and intentional and malicious, rather than mostly the result of blind spots, and people not realizing that what they've written is poorly framed, or what they've written misrepresents something, that the tone somehow biases what they've written or said on air. So public and political discourse about bias in news media often operates on these assumptions that it's intentional and malicious and blatant, and everybody's doing it. There's a real downside to that for students, that you can make them think that everything is out to somehow manipulate them, that everything has some kind of secret agenda, and that can tend to make them very cynical about credible sources of information. It can also lead them to think that all information is created equal. So the vast majority of journalistic standards-based outlets are really trying, not just individually, but collectively, to be accurate and fair. And really, I think that thinking of biases as a series of blind spots is important, and that's one big reason why newsroom diversity is so important. Here's a little bit of the follow-up from that Baghdadi headline in the Washington Post, and you'll see Karen Tumulty, who's a veteran at the Post, sort of take on someone who's criticizing the Post, and says, really, look, I think this was human error. It was a skeleton crew on a Sunday. There was lots of copy. There was a deadline pressure. They wrote a bad headline. There was no nefarious sort of overarching attempt to push any kind of agenda. Also, if you're interested in the issue of newsroom diversity, definitely check out ASNI's work on this front. ASNI just announced that they're discontinuing this survey, though, which is unfortunate. Don't really have time to get into that. Fourth key point, bias in news really is a spectrum and not a binary. So I think people tend to think of bias operating in an either or, like either something is biased or it's not. And, you know, quality news organizations really work to minimize the influence of bias. And so even though pure objectivity or perfect objectivity is unattainable, it can be pursued or aspired to. So news reports don't really fall into those two buckets, but rather they fall along a spectrum. So you might see 3 or 4 or 5 headlines about a specific story in the same news cycle and think that one actually is a little bit better or a little fairer or more accurate than another. And those are good comparisons to have, but making it a comparative spectrum-driven conversation rather than a binary is very helpful. And then finally, you know, again, this is a very complex, sort of nuanced concept, but it's one that's pressing. It's one that's very important to address with students. So it requires nuance and specificity when we're evaluating for it. So again, there are many types of bias. It's not just partisanship, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then, helping students understand the different types and the different forms that those types of biases can take can really help them better evaluate news coverage and respond to any kind of problematic or biased news coverage when warranted. And really, again, we have to watch out that we don't encourage or nurture cynicism in our students. I just want to show the front page of the Minneapolis Star Tribune today. They've had to choose a lead image. The most recent development in the story was a series of fires and break-ins and unrest overnight. And so that was the lead photo here. We could sort of look at the way the Star Tribune has covered the story over time. We could look at the way other outlets have covered that and talk about what other lead photo maybe should have been chosen, or if this was a good lead photo. Is a striking image. It captures one aspect of the story. And there's only so much work an image can do. So if you actually go to the website now, they have a gallery up. So they have a lead image they've chosen, but you can sort of click through the gallery because they have to choose one image to be the lead. But of course, that image can't be everything and can't represent the entire story. Here's a tweet from a Star Tribune journalist here, and Tim Graham of the Media Research Center sort of responding to her. Graham here is saying that liberal journalists kind of go out of their way to make excuses for what he calls looting and rioting. Of course, those two words many think are loaded. Here's a response from someone who thinks that coverage is problematic in a different way, that they're only taking pictures of rioting and looting. So we could test these perceptions, right? We could test Graham's claim and really do a quick analysis of some coverage. We could also test this particular user's claims as well. So again, here are those key points. I want to pause here before we pivot into talking about the 5 types of bias that we're going to introduce, and then some of the forms that bias can take. And I'm going to bring my colleague, Susana Gonzalez, on, who is our Associate Director of Education, 20 years in journalism, so she's well positioned. And Miriam, I thought we could get some of the questions. I know it's been a busy chat, so let's hear what folks are asking and maybe take a few of these questions on.
Absolutely, sure thing. So we have a couple of questions regarding biases or perceived biases. Is it possible that there is a separation between the individual journalists and the news organizations themselves? I feel differently about individual journalists versus news organizations as a whole.
Yes, although I think a lot of people think that news organizations generally operate in ways that they don't. I think a lot of people think that news outlets, that all news outlets pursue some kind of agenda, that editors or some senior newsroom leader comes around and says, you're going to push the story this way, or you're going to push the story that way. And that's not really how newsrooms operate. So I know people have strong feelings about particular outlets, maybe for past coverage that they felt was problematic or a pattern of problematic coverage. I just think it's important to be fair and to remember that our experience of coverage is impartial and is imperfect and incomplete. So before we sort of judge an entire outlet based on coverage, we should really look at their coverage to make sure that our perception of the coverage is true, and then really take action, respond, write a letter to the editor. And if you feel like that's an ongoing problem, seek another source, but definitely follow journalists you think are do quality work as individuals.
And parallel to that is, does ownership of news outlets affect their bias or perceived biases?
It's not supposed to, right? And maybe Susanna can chime in here. There is supposed to be a very strong firewall between the business interests of a news outlet, including the ownership, and the coverage. And I think that's something that's important for students to understand. It's important for students to know about and to watch out for. So when there's a scandal, for example, right now with Amazon, it's interesting to watch the way the Post covers that. If the newsroom is truly independent, their coverage should look similar to other outlets' coverage and should also obviously disclose the relationship. Susanna, do you have anything to add there about corporate ownership?
Sure, I agree with what you're saying, Peter. I would just add that it's responsible coverage. If you see, for example, I mean, the Washington Post does this in their coverage of of Amazon, the company, Amazon.com. They'll include a line in their story that says something to the effect of the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon.com. So look out for lines like that. And that is the news organization's way of being transparent about their ownership.
Yep. And I think when there have been sort of oversteps, for example, you know, Sinclair Broadcasting was in the news a year ago or so for pushing specific segments and forcing local affiliates to run those segments. They weren't sort of telling local affiliates how to cover local issues or other pieces of coverage, but they were delivering prepackaged segments that they said you must run. And that was controversial and actually got a lot of coverage in other news outlets. So when journalistic standards are breached, it is a big story, and it actually damages the credibility of the news outlet, and that's good. News outlets watch each other for that, but we all should as well.
Okay, so we have one here from Roberto. Just a small thought. Wouldn't it be best if TV news outlets had a separate channel for punditry and analysis that could help stem the tide of perceived bias in the news, so that people have a tough time differentiating between, quote, news anchors and pundits and analysis versus the report?
Yes, I think that would be clearer. You know, the way all news organizations organize and label and distinguish between straight coverage and opinion coverage is important. That was easier in the print edition. It's harder with everything online being shared as URLs, and it can be really blurry and hard on television and specifically cable news. But yeah, I think that would be effective. Susanna, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the labeling of opinion and news and how important that is.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I would just suggest when you're watching a CNN, for example, or another cable news or TV program, that you pay special attention to how speakers are labeled. And the same goes for if you're encountering a piece in a newspaper, for example, online or in the print edition, really pay attention to the labels there as well. Opinion pieces are labeled with common labels such as opinion, commentary, viewpoint, editorial, and it's important. It can be confusing in this complex information landscape to tell the difference between an opinion, a comment, a specific point of view, and a straight news piece of journalism. So I would just suggest that you pay special attention to labels.
Yep, absolutely. And news outlets label things differently, and they use terms like analysis and commentary and opinion and a bit differently between outlets, which makes it tough on the reader. And another question is, do those labels carry over into social media previews? So when you just see a news outlet and a headline, it could be the headline for a column that is overtly an opinion column, but if you don't see the label opinion, or it doesn't come from an account devoted to opinion, that can feel blurry to people as well.
And just one more point to add, I think that news organizations are trying to do a better job of being transparent about their process and you know, whether or not a piece is opinion. The Columbus, Ohio newspaper, for example, has started putting a disclaimer at the top of each of their opinion pieces. And I think that other newspapers are taking similar steps.
Yep, some newspapers are even explaining to readers the kinds of conversations and deliberations they had when they selected a given image for the lead photo, for example, or why they chose to do a certain story. And I think that's all good. News organizations don't have a ton of capacity. They're shrinking and they're trying to stay afloat, but it's important for them to do that work, I think, for sure. Let's move on real quick, and Miriam, unless you've got something absolutely on fire that needs to be answered, and then we'll get to stuff in the next Q&A.
We have several. There's a little bit of a pattern here,
Sure.
and I think this might be quick because so I want to remind folks to take a look at our prior 2 webinars that might help address this too.
Okay.
Getting students to determine which media outlets are standards-based. So we're going to share the link to all of our recorded webinars towards the end.
Yeah.
And like the Fighting Fake webinar, Exploring Misinformation Landscape might help with that. But folks are, there's several requests about it.
Yeah, I think, there's really no replacement for helping students understand what the standards of quality journalism are. Those really aren't controversial, right? No one thinks journalism should be inaccurate, should be unfair. No one thinks stories should be poorly sourced. And so once they have that understanding, and they not only know what the standards are, but they can recognize what they look like in practice, then they can start to evaluate sources of news and information. And I think the differences which will jump out to them more. I mean, that sort of enable them to differentiate between different sources of news, if that makes sense. We can circle back to that in a bit. We will have a couple other moments of Q&A. I do want to just roll out and introduce this framework that we've developed for teaching about news media bias. We do have a lesson in our Checkology virtual classroom devoted to this topic, and it introduces and uses this same structure. So I'm going to talk just briefly about 5 types of news media bias, and then give you hypothetical examples of what these would look like. And again, because bias is so subjective, what looks like bias or counts as bias to one person doesn't necessarily as another. I'm not using actual examples of coverage in the follow-up here. I'm going to use some hypotheticals. So first, obviously, is partisan bias. I think most people understand, what this type of bias would be. It's when coverage unfairly favors one or another political viewpoint on an issue, one or another political party, one or another candidate in a political race. A demographic bias would be when the demographics of the people in the newsroom, the people working on the story, introduce blind spots or affect their work in ways that distort it, that cause it to be biased. That might be, cause it to be biased in ways, in gendered ways, cause it to be racially biased, cause it to be ideologically biased. Sometimes if you don't have a diverse enough newsroom in any of those sort of categories. And again, that is a major compelling reason for newsroom diversity, really all of these to minimize bias. Corporate bias is another potential kind of bias, even though firewalls and sort of strict standards exist to protect editorial independence in newsrooms. It is possible that the ownership interests of a news outlet can somehow interfere with or cause journalists, even inadvertently, because they're aware of who their parent company is, to bias coverage. So that's another type that we all need to be aware of and to watch out for. Also a bias, what we call neutrality bias. A lot of people call this either false balance or both sidesism. But a really key point here is that neutrality and objectivity, or the aspiration to be objective, are not the same thing. If something's demonstrably false, if something's demonstrably damaging, if something is demonstrably happening and alarming, like climate change, coverage about that issue shouldn't be neutral. It shouldn't present it as a 50-50, no matter what. If it does, that's what people refer to as false balance. So making something look like, one side said this, one side says that, and the coverage doesn't really help the public understand the reality of the issue. The reality of the issue of climate change is that it's happening, that it's largely caused by our behavior, and that it's a real threat. The reality behind vaccines is that they work. So if news organizations try to be neutral on those questions, they're actually not being objective. So there is a way you can be biased and have what we call neutrality bias. And then another bias that gets overlooked, I think, a lot is a bias toward big stories. So journalists want to break big stories, news outlets want to break big stories, and sometimes they lean into big stories. I think this happened with the Covington Catholic story on the National Mall, when video surfaced of some students from Kentucky facing down or standing in the path of some folks who were marching, and it turns out that the protesters and marchers sort of approached the teens, and when more video surfaced, the fuller story was clear. It looked like a big story, and news organizations really leaned into that. Of course, other people really saw a lot of partisan bias in that as well. But news outlets really do have to guard against a desire to run after what they think is a big story. If the initial perception is that something is a big story, that can bias coverage. So let's take a look at some of these hypotheticals here. In this first scenario, in a year of covering advances in cancer research, a particular health reporter, and again, these are made up, hypothetical, quotes dozens of doctors and other experts, but only 2 in the course of a year are women. So in the chat, I mean, this is pretty straightforward example of one of these 5 types of bias. How might you answer that? Yeah, so Jessica's got a demographic bias, indeed. So that's what demographic bias could look like. Second example, if the producer of a morning news show inadvertently, unintentionally dedicated more airtime or more coverage to her preferred presidential candidate's platform than other candidates who were polling equally well, that could be an example of partisan bias, so you all are on it. Senior editors at a local outlet decide that a scandal about their parent company, allegations of corruption, are not newsworthy enough to warrant extensive coverage, but instead, so they decide to publish that story in a short report in the business section, but other outlets put the story on the front page that day. That would be corporate bias. That's a possible scenario. Fourth, the social media manager at a national newspaper posts a story about a UN climate change report, and the graphic has a caption saying, "Is climate change man-made? Click here to find out." That is a bias to neutrality. So that would be a kind of false balance, right? Not presenting the story with the right frame. And a journalist who spends most of his time in a metropolitan area travels to a nearby rural community, and in his report uses the phrase, "a simple God-fearing slice of America," to describe this community. That would be another form of demographic bias, right? So I left out big story bias there, but you get the idea. I want to pause here for questions just really quick about these 5 types to see if anyone has questions about those before we move on to the forms or how these biases might show themselves in coverage.
Okay, so we have a question here from Dolores. What are news organizations doing to help journalists identify implicit bias when reporting? What tools can be added to their toolkit to address their blind spots in thinking?
I can take this one, Peter.
Yeah, please go ahead.
First, I would say that minimizing bias in news coverage is a collective effort made by everyone who is involved in the story. So I mainly worked in print and for a wire service. So that would include me and any other reporters involved in a story, then including our immediate editors who take the first look at a story, and then editors on a copy desk, as well as more senior editors and or lawyers if it's a very sensitive issue, as well as photojournalists, as well as graphic designers. Everyone involved in a story is looking for, is working to make a story as fair and accurate as possible.
Yeah, I think too, there's a lot of discussion about this. You know, what methods and approaches are most effective. Some people think, you know, that journalists should work to disclose their biases somehow, which I think is interesting because if they're, you know, that they are really often blind spots, so we don't know what we don't know, and they are, you know, therefore really difficult to disclose. So I think, you know, as Susanna said, working together, but also, you know, following methods like usage standards are there to strip out biases, to standardize the use of particular terms, especially controversial terms.
For sure.
Okay, so I have 2 similar or related questions. Dale is asking about how the quote "to get the story out first" bias, and Karen wants to know where omission would fall within these biases.
Omission?
Omission.
Uh-huh. Get the story out first, I would think, is just like kind of big story bias, trying to be first, even if it's not a particularly big story, but a reasonably sized story. That, you know, the faster news organizations operate, the more opportunities there are for error. That's true of anybody's work. And I think news outlets are constantly trying to balance the need to be fast, but the need to be right. And a quality outlet will make sure that to put accuracy over speed, for sure. I think acts of omission are actually a way that different biases could present themselves. So we'll talk about that in a minute, because we're going to talk about story selection as a form of bias, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
All right. So here we have one. The 5 types that you just went over, Peter, are those universal or defined by NLP?
Defined by NLP. So this is a framework that we've introduced in an introductory lesson to, you know, understanding and thinking about news media bias. And so we've found that those 5 types are helpful. You know, we're not claiming that they're absolutely comprehensive, but they are 5 major drivers of potential bias that we think students should be aware of.
Okay. Judith is asking, don't you think that news agencies may be hiring people that seem to agree with their own bias and political following?
Or sorry, say that first part again.
Do you think that news agencies may be hiring people that seem to agree with their own bias and political following?
To agree with the hiring manager's biases? I mean, I don't know. I don't think that in an interview, I mean, I'd be interested in Susanna's thoughts here, but I don't think they really talk about their personal politics. I think a good hiring manager should look for a reporter whose work is fair and accurate and high quality, and whose ethics are strong. And, you know, they wouldn't really get into their personal politics in an interview. But Susanna?
Sure. I mean, every time I've been hired by a news organization, one of our first conversations relates to the ethics of the ethical guidelines that I'm expected to follow as a news reporter for the agency. So I've never been asked my politics. That has never come into play.
Great, and we will, I should say now, stay on late for more questions, but I want to make sure we push through these last 5 forms that the 5 types I just introduced can take, and then we'll wrap up, and then we'll do more Q&A if that's okay with everybody. Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, you know, the 5 types are really 5 big potential drivers of news media bias, but what do those look like in practice? So what are the different ways that, for example, corporate bias or demographic bias or partisan bias could show themselves in coverage? So one obvious way is the tone, the language used in a piece. Tone can also extend, especially in broadcast, to B-roll, to music, to other elements in production. The way a story is framed, so that example that I showed about climate change, we'll take another look at. An absence of fairness and balance, so something that's just patently unfair, that leaves out important sources from one particular side of a story, that takes people out of context, is another form that bias can take. Story selection, the stories that news outlets either decide to pursue and do, or the stories that they decide to lead or make most prominent, send push notifications about, post to social media, and so on. And then finally, sourcing. And sorry, on story selection, that's really where, to answer that bias of omission question, I mean, you know, the stories you decide not to do, the sources you decide not to talk to, you know, that's how I would sort of understand acts of omission could actually fall into a number of these forms that bias can take. And then finally, the sourcing, the people that you talk to, and again, different types of biases can express themselves in the way a story is sourced. So let's look at these scenarios just one more time super quickly. This went pretty quickly the first time. We already looked at this scenario, the producer who inadvertently gives more airtime to a preferred candidate for president. We already said that this was partisan bias. What form would that be taking here? Of these 5 forms, this hypothetical scenario could be story selection, but actually, yes, it's an absence of fairness and balance. I think it's more about fairness and balance than the other forms here, to make sure that your coverage over time balances between 2 candidates. I think that doesn't make it neutral, but they do want kind of equal airtime and an equal number of stories or an equal amount of attention over time. On any one given day, that may not be true for broadcast or print. This rural representation scenario, when a print journalist who really comes from a big city called a community a simple God-fearing slice of America, yeah, that's an example of a demographic bias expressing itself as tone. Senior editors who are kind of burying a story or treating it differently that has to do with corruption at their parent company. Yes, that's story selection. So that's how this story was covered, but not very much, and sort of buried on an inside page, not run on the front page. And then again, this issue where the climate change story was led and with the question, is climate change man-made? That's a problem with framing, as you all are recognizing. So the way a story is framed, so this is a bias to neutrality expressing itself as a problem with framing. And then finally here, the health reporter who quoted dozens of doctors and other experts, but only 2 are women. We said that this is a demographic bias, but it is expressing itself here as sourcing or insourcing. And I've even heard journalists say that they keep a list of all their sources to make sure they don't inadvertently have lopsided sourcing throughout the course of their coverage, so over the course of a year, for example. So I want to make 5 more key points to make a clean 10, so we can send you this list of 10, and then we'll just open up for Q&A. In general, I think that thinking about objectivity, which is a really loaded term, which is divisive, which is misunderstood, which is technically impossible to achieve, thinking about that as a combination of being fair and accurate is more useful here. So thinking about the aspiration to be unbiased, the aspiration to be as fair and accurate as possible, I think is more helpful and useful. Being unbiased does not mean being neutral. We've already said that, but I think it's worth saying again. A lot of people conflate those 2 terms. Teaching students to test their perceptions of bias and then try to fix the problems they find. So it's one thing to say that headline's biased. It's another to rewrite it in a way that makes it unbiased or that you think minimizes the bias. If students are able to do that, it's actually very empowering for them because they can then talk back to sources of news or at particular outlets when they see a piece of coverage that they think is somehow lacking or problematic. Again, warn students away from making sweeping hyperbolic generalizations about the media or making statements about what the media wants you to think or wants you to believe. Those are really unproductive and don't really help zero in on the issues. So again, specificity and nuance is so key. And finally, a perception of bias is the beginning, not the end of student inquiry. You know, if we put up that Star Tribune front page from today in a classroom and ask students, what's the bias? They would find things because we've asked them to, right? But if we compared coverage of the protests and then what happened overnight in Minneapolis, we would get a clearer picture about differences in coverage and then could have a more productive conversation. So if students perceive bias, they really need to go out and test those perceptions, try to fix them, and then go from there. So that's really the beginning, not the end of the process. So here are the 10. Again, we're going to try to figure out a way to lay these out if you find them helpful and send those to you in follow-up. And again, we have a great lesson. If you're interested in this framework of types and forms and really helping students zero in on this, this is hosted by Indira Lakshmanan, who's a veteran journalist, now just recently moved to National Geographic. She sort of leads students through the lesson as a virtual teacher. Please check it out on Checkology if you're interested in learning more about that. And we will go to Q&A. And again, I know we don't have much time left, but we will stay late and we will take your questions in follow-up. So I'll let Miriam join us here, and great.
Thanks, Peter. Good question by Shonda, and speaking of students. Does children's digital fluency allow them to distinguish between fake news and real news online?
Yes, I think, our last session about digital verification and, opening a new tab, doing some reading about the source that you're looking at. A lot of students, aren't familiar with sources like RT, for example, which is a Russian state government news outlet that really pushes itself as a trendy, modern sort of millennial news outlet. But it is consistently pushing, Kremlin-friendly talking points. They do not aspire to quality journalism standards. They are a state propaganda outlet. The Epoch Times is making a big push and targeting consumers on social media, including a lot of teens. And that is not really a standards-based news outlet. It has some real clear problems in its editorial independence. But it's hard for students to parse that out unless they just open a new tab and read about that source. And then when it comes to fake images and things, I think knowing how to do reverse image searches and being, wary of that kind of thing, again, which we talked about last time, is super helpful. So yes, I think yes.
Okay, question from Anne. Do you define bias as a pattern by a reporter or news organization over time, or is it acceptable to call one story biased?
I think one story can be biased, but it depends on the circumstances, and I'd love Susanna's take here too. If you jump in your car and you turn on NPR and they're profiling one candidate in a race, you can't then assume that they've left the other candidate out, because they may do a profile of the other candidate later, after that, the next day. So sometimes you have to look at coverage over time. I think that Star Tribune front page is a good example of that. You have to look at the kinds of images they've captured and featured across coverage to see if there's a kind of pattern. Other times, it could be a sort of, in a single story, there could be an overt example of that. Susanna, do you have any other thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, I agree. I think that it's more fair if you are making an accusation of bias toward a news organization to evaluate several pieces of news coverage over time. And then if you're still seeing a pattern, you might engage with the news organization in a respectful dialogue about your concerns. And then you can bring to them evidence that you found in your evaluation.
I see a comment in chat. I just want to take this up real quick. Amelia, yes, you're right. And I don't think either I or Susanna meant to say that there aren't hiring issues in newsrooms. This is another reason why newsroom diversity, particularly in newsroom leadership, which has an even worse problem when it comes to newsroom diversity. In hiring, I think there are a lot of issues in hiring practices. I thought the question was mostly about whether a news outlet might specifically hire people to align to a specific agenda or ideology. I think that's less of an issue, but yes, obviously there are ways in which hiring practices affect coverage and affect newsroom diversity and either minimize or exaggerate or maximize blind spots in potentially problematic ways, for sure. But thank you for that. Okay. Sorry, Miriam, go ahead if you have another question.
I forgot I had muted myself.
Okay.
Not that any of us have ever done that before. Okay, here we go. Gina is asking, how do wire services like Reuters play into this discussion of bias? Newspapers will sometimes change headlines when they run stories from wire services, right? Do they also modify the body of the article from wire services too? Have there been any controversies about articles from wire services that newspapers should not have run?
As a wire service alum of Reuters, I can take this one. No controversies come to mind, but I would say that the writing of headlines is very much part of this effort to is 100% part of the effort to be fair and accurate through news coverage. That includes the words that are included in the headline. You're correct that newspapers will sometimes change headlines when they run wire services, and this has been done in my experience because a newspaper feels that they have an idea for a better, more appropriate headline for their audience. For example, if a wire services story at Reuters, for example, we took a more global approach to and always kept in mind a global audience. But if a newspaper whose audience has a local readership, they might emphasize in the headline, a Chicago facet of the story, for example. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I think comparing headlines on the same wire service piece might be a great activity to do with students. If you Google the lead paragraph, you should be able to come up with different outlets that have run the same piece by Reuters or AP or another wire, and then look at the differences in headlines and maybe think about why those differences exist. And if one is problematic, then again, you start with that perception of bias, test it a little bit, and reach out to the outlet.
Okay, a question from Peter. Can you really argue that any piece of journalism is unbiased, even when journalists are following good journalistic standards? How objective really is evaluation of what constitutes real objectivity?
Right. Again, I think yes, it being perfectly unbiased is not only impossible, it would be impossible for any of us to decide what counts as being perfectly unbiased, but any human has potential biases and blind spots. And I think people generally agree there's no way to weed all of those out, that pure or perfect objectivity is impossible. However, as a goal, as an aspiration, I think it is productive and worthwhile. Certainly we can look at coverage from overtly partisan sources like Daily Chaos and Breitbart and Democracy Now! And things like that, and compare that to mainstream coverage and see real differences where there's an aspiration to be fair and accurate, where there's an aspiration to minimize bias, and where there's an aspiration to really not, or there's no aspiration to do that. So I think, even though it's impossible, and even though no one should ever sort of don a story as being perfectly unbiased, we should, I think, appreciate the pursuit of being unbiased or being objective or being as fair and accurate as possible. And really parsing the differences is so rich to do with students, to think about what's the fairer way to do this. Look how this outlet did that versus this. It didn't mean that one outlet had an intent to mislead anyone. It's just that maybe one outlet got a story a little better in one regard. And that same is true of headlines or lead images, whatever you're comparing. So again, along a spectrum, even if the pole or the goal of that spectrum is impossible.
Okay, here is another one. This is from Colleen. How do I know which paper is known for the truth and that it's not just saying what I wanted to hear, right? How will I know when it's the truth?
Well, I think that isn't just limited to newspapers, and I'd love Susanna to weigh in here as well. But reading coverage across outlets and looking for signals of trust. So really thinking honestly about what is fair, what is accurate, and then seeking news from a variety of sources that do aspire to standards. So they're accountable for their mistakes, they're transparent, they correct errors, and make that determination for yourself, and to help students do that as well. I don't think there's one outlet that anybody can sort of steer you to. There are a lot of quality news outlets out there, but everybody has to make those determinations for themselves. Susanna, yes. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I would agree with everything you've said, Peter. I think two main points are, if you do have a question about whether or not an item is accurate, I would, check other quality, reputable sources to see if they are reporting the same information. And then I agree also with your other point, Peter, about, look for signs signs that you can trust a particular news organization, such as corrections. Although, journalists, find running a correction painful, they
Right.
are signs of transparency, accountability, and their commitment to the truth and setting the record straight. Editors' notes is another similar example.
Yep.
Even longer pieces that are written by a top editor explaining how the news organization treated specific coverage of a story. That's a sign of transparency as well.
Great. And also, just to let people know, another plug for referring back to the prior webinars. And we'll include also in our resource folder, we have an article called How to Know What to Trust, the 7 Steps, that might be helpful as well.
Yes, indeed. That infographic can kind of lay out how to work through questions to ask of different sources, for sure. Good thought. Any other questions that we want to take on here in the open Q&A? I know we're over time, but willing to stay if you all are.
Let's see one more here, or 2. Let's see. Sarah, when you say a story is, quote, well sourced, what exactly does that mean? And what are considered the standards of sourcing?
So, Susanna, I want you to answer this. I'll give my quick take just in terms of what is taught in Checkology and in the lessons, and generally speaking, news reports should be sourced to people who are in a position to know the information they're providing, and also providing information that is necessary or important to the story. No important source, certainly no one involved in an incident, should be left out of the sourcing. Sometimes people decline to comment, but then that should be noted. That goes back to the point Susanna was making about transparency. Susanna, do you want to answer that a little more fully?
Sure. Yes, I would say a news report is well sourced if it includes information that is relevant to a particular news event from various viewpoints, as well as from speakers who are, as Peter mentioned, in a position to know, have the authority to speak on a particular topic. Sources such as, and there are different kinds of sources that we didn't really touch on here, but, such as eyewitness sources, documents, raw video that we've seen included in many recent news sources or news coverage. There are various types of sources. I would say, and some of you might have heard, or seen unnamed sources attributed to a news coverage. And I would just say that, if you do see an unnamed source, to just be wary because they are not identified by name.
Yeah, most news outlets have really strict guidelines about the use of anonymous sources. There has to be a really compelling reason. They have to be able to obviously identify the identity of the person themselves, the reporter and usually a top editor. They have to, ideally be able to independently confirm that information is either authentic and so on. And as Susanna mentioned, different stories require a different collection of sources. If, some stories about a breaking news event or an incident might include, official sources, which, often are, say, the police, eyewitnesses who are at the scene, the parties involved, any companies involved, officials from those sources, from those companies, and then sometimes documents, as Susanna mentioned, sometimes expert sources who are more insightful and independent, but not directly related to the event. So it is a collection of source information that the journalist is is pulling together. And that's what reporting involves, pulling together that information, confirming it, and then presenting it for the public.
Okay, this one is a great lead-in to our resources, Peter.
Sure.
Tom is asking, does an LP have lessons we can use in our classes to teach this?
We do. So, the best way, if you're looking to teach this specific topic of bias, is our lesson Understanding Bias, which lives on our Checkology virtual classroom at checkology.org. We will give you links to those. And Miriam, forgive me, I'm not sure what we have in the resource folder regarding Checkology, but I'm sure there's links or some information there as well, correct?
There is some information on there, and we actually have a slide as well.
Oh, we do.
There you go.
Yeah, so if you go to the URL here, you can register for an account. You can use it one-to-many with students. You can use it one-to-one. Some teachers find it helpful to just go through the lessons themselves for background on a specific topic that they want to work on and address. And then we have documentation for teachers to help them blend it with classroom instruction, discussion suggestions, bell ringer suggestions, and so on. So definitely check that out. We are working on launching a resource library on our website in the fall. And we also publish a weekly email newsletter. Susanna and I actually write it together and publish it every Monday called The Sift. You can check out the archives. We just went on summer vacation. So we will be back with The Sift in September. But the archives can be useful for you as well, with some ideas for integrating some of the themes and concepts we've talked about. And then also our mobile app, Informable, can also help address some topics. We don't have a mode in Informable that addresses bias specifically, but it's definitely worth checking out. And yes, Maureen, the resources are free. We did go through a 2-year period where we were charging a modest amount for student licenses for Checkology, and we just announced that will no longer be the case. We took our paywall down for the pandemic, and we are leaving it down for the future. So yes, they are no cost to educators. Any other questions, or should we sign off here, Miriam?
I think we're good. So if we didn't get to your question, again, we're going to download these and give ourselves a little bit of time to get to it. The slide that's up now, Newslit Camp, do we want to mention that a bit, Peter, or are we moving?
No, I mean, we do PD events across the country. If you're interested in those or interested in professional development generally, just check out our website, follow NLP on social media, and stay up to date on what we're up to on that front.
Please do, and be sure to do our survey if you don't mind. We really appreciate the feedback. It helps us do every webinar even better. So hope you can take a few minutes, very short.
Please, please. And thank you again to so many of you. Thanks to Susanna for chiming in and helping out with the Q&A, and to Miriam and John and Jordan and the whole NLP team for helping this webinar run so smoothly today. And thanks to all of you for joining. And if you joined us for all 4, thank you so much. This concludes the May series. And stay tuned again. Follow us on social media. John and Miriam have a lot planned on the professional development front. So be sure you keep up with what we're up to, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.